And recognize Senator Schmitt for his comments and questions.
Thank you. Mr. Duda Gupta, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. You know, in your written testimony, it talked about you object to any repeal of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act as ill-advised. Is that accurate?
I think we're talking about the energy provisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tax provisions.
Right.
They help, yes, they help
Right.
us achieve our climate goals.
Does that make things more expensive at all? Do you think those sort of onerous regulations on, say, things like dishwashers or refrigerators make those items more expensive?
I'm not familiar with or did not focus on regulations, but the.
Okay, well, let's turn to, because I do want to talk about inflation. So I think there's no way you could argue that the amount of money that we have spent in the last couple of years hasn't contributed to inflation. You would agree with that, right?
I think throughout the world, yes.
Well, I'm talking about in the United States, in this Congress or the previous Congress spending money in the United States. You would agree with that, right?
I think that among other factors, there may have been more demand in the economy than the supply could meet. But in my view, it's the supply that was the challenge, especially in the pandemic.
So spending has helped lead to inflation, correct?
Relative to the supply challenges, yes.
Okay. And you mentioned that one of your objections with any work requirements is that we shouldn't do anything to increase hardships. That was your testimony earlier, right?
That's right.
Does the amount of spending that the federal government undertake and thereby inflation, doesn't that lead to a hardship for lower income individuals?
All other things being equal, inflation can be harmful to lower income individuals, but we've also, for the first time in recorded history, completely closed the black-white employment gap and had the lowest unemployment rates in half a century.
Well, I mean, you also mentioned that communities of color are usually first in, or last in, first out, right?
In the labor market, yes.
Right. But I want to stay on the topic of hardship. If things are more expensive for lower income individuals, if milk is more expensive or gas is more expensive, that disproportionately affects lower income individuals. You would agree with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, right, we're facing, that the sheer amount of money that's being spent, and including in the budget that the president has submitted, $7 trillion worth of new spending, $5 trillion worth of revenue. It's deficit spending, number one, but the amount of money that's being pumped into the economy, that and our energy policy, I mean, it's not a tornado or an act of God. Inflation, there's a formula for it, and if you have more expensive energy or less energy, and you're spending trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, that the cost of everything is going to go up. And I would, I appreciate you advocating for, disadvantaged communities. I would think that that's exactly what I'm doing when we make things more expensive like we have.
We just don't want to cause mass unemployment. And of course, the Federal Reserve will respond as prices go up
Right, well, they raise interest rates, which makes things more expensive, right? And so that's one issue. And you talk about employment. I do want to talk about some other policies that have contributed to this, vaccine mandates in particular. We saw millions of people displaced from their jobs from vaccine mandates. And I wanted to we're talking about, the chairman had mentioned previously that we're talking about spending, we're talking about revenue, we're talking about overall economic growth. The idea that we were firing nurses because of vaccine mandates, that certainly didn't help the situation either, right?
For me?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. It probably protects public health, so that could keep more people able to work and well.
So firing a nurse because she didn't want to take a vaccine, your argument is that protected public health?
That would be the argument for vaccine mandate, yes.
Right, well, okay. Well, I would argue that didn't happen, and we're talking about people who were disproportionately affected. I mean, you're talking about advocating for communities of color, probably had a lower vaccination rate, right?
Yes.
Correct. So probably disproportionately more fired because they chose not to take a vaccine, right?
I don't know. It was for particular occupations. I don't know the data, but of course we kept people alive through those mandates.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to get into a COVID debate with you, but I would argue that by forcing 80 million people through OSHA to have a medical procedure or lose your job was COVID tyranny. and affected people. We're talking about advocating for people who already find it difficult to afford things by losing their job because they were making that decision. I can't believe that that's the best policy for the United States of America. So anyway, all of these things in a vacuum don't make a lot of sense. The spending is out of control, and I don't hear anything really in your testimony about controlling spending. It's about revenue, and it's about not creating any hardships, but inflation in and of itself has created a hardship.
I have lots of ideas for controlling spending if we have time.
Well, I just want to ask one final question for very quickly. Doctor, there was a scenario laid out before I came back, and I'm the last person to inquire, so I promise I'm going to wrap this up very, very quickly. But we went through this scenario of what happens if I overspend and what happens to the credit rating and that sort of scenario. Do you think, I mean, there's a new proposed rule by the Biden administration to punish people who actually have a good credit rating, who've played by the rules, who didn't go down that road, right? To actually pay more for their mortgage, to subsidize mortgages for people who with lower credit scores. Do you think those are appropriate incentives that we ought to encourage?
I apologize, I'm not familiar with the executive order.
So if you have a good credit rating, you will pay more for your mortgage to subsidize mortgages for people with poor credit ratings. Do you think that's good policy?
So we use housing policy in this country and mortgage policy in this country in all sorts of complicated ways, and part of it is redistributive. Think about the support that we offer to FHA. So I can believe that one of the policies that we would want to incorporate into the enormous federal support for mortgages and home ownership in this country includes redistribution to spur home ownership among lower income communities. That would just be part of a panoply of
Well, it's interesting,
policies.
and I'll close with this. It's fascinating that you're here telling us that, which I agree with, by the way, this idea that we continue to deficit spend, and this is terrible policy, and it's irresponsible. And then later on in your testimony, you're now saying it's actually okay to punish people who've played by the rules to have to pay more for their mortgage. I find that incredibly inconsistent. So I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman.